it is the fall, and since it's October, it's not 99 degrees outside, it's only 92. So I'll take what small things I can get for sure. I have a lot of regions in terms of the topic for today, American regionalism through fiction, and I've divided up the United States a lot. So we might get to about half of it. Maybe we get to the Mississippi River. That would be nice. We will see, but there's just so many ways of dividing things. And in the beginning, I have a bunch of maps that are kind of my ethos behind how to divide things. So, with no further ado, gosh, 46, Rhonda, 46. I would love that in Kentucky. Heck yeah. That does sound amazing. I would probably get sick of it after a little while, but yeah, after living in Texas for quite a while, I miss seasons. I miss the fall leaves changing. I if people are talking about a pumpkin spice latte and they're having a hot latte and it's 90 some degrees outside, that seems a little off to me. I think they should wait a little bit, perhaps. So, we're gonna rely on the chat right here. As people are coming in and stuff like that, and if there's anybody in the waiting room, I'll try to get them in ASAP, y'all. Welcome and thank you for joining us. So, in terms of the United States, it is a massive place for sure and has stretched across the country bit by bit for sure. As we are looking at these different things, a lot of them on the East Coast will be a bit smaller for sure than when you get out to the West, and it feels like states are more homogenous. But there are even differences in the West that I found that were very surprising to me. So I toss it in the chat. This is a question. What is America? I we're going through some political upheaval in this country, and it's very interesting to think about the fact that I really want to have some Americana right now. I want to think about this country and what it represents. And we're looking at different regions and how they have characteristics, but there's an overarching one. And in this case, I did find several different authors who are claimed by a bunch of different regions when I was doing my research. So this was so interesting to see. A bunch of regions claim Hunter S. Thompson, Jack Kerouac, Mark Twain, Truman Capote, Washington Irving. Why was Florida trying to claim Washington Irving? William Faulkner. Why was Chicago trying to claim William Faulkner? And F. Scott Fitzgerald. Just they travel around a lot. And so some of these authors, some of them are regional, some of them are more pan-Americana kind of things, and they mix and match. So, in terms of the criteria, I was trying to look at this in terms of authors who lived in a place for a period of time, might have been born there, or might have been writing at the time that they were living, in the particular place. Their settings, and even if it was fantasy, sci-fi, different world, different time period, how are they using the things around them? And try to determine what some of these characteristics are. So, in general, when you're looking at the US, you might come across a map something like this. You have the Midwest all the way from Ohio to North Dakota. The West is absolutely gigantic. What does, in terms of the Southwest, Houston have to do with the deserts of Arizona? And saying the Southeast, which is, really the South, stretching that whole way, do they have similar characteristics? Well, looked at a map like this after that. And this is the American biomes, kind of in different places, like what environments you have. So when you are writing about a place, you are using what you see outside, whether it's today or it's, more historical and stuff, or it's much more nature-based and stuff. When you have something like on Walden Pond in New England, he's using very much what is of the place. When you're talking about a Western, it is set in the West and has these wide open vistas, and these biomes play a lot into it. Absolutely. I'm gonna check this chat real quick and make sure everything's cool. My Barbara Kingsolver, this is from Rhonda. Barbara Kingsolver stretches her work quite a distance. Kentucky claims her. Yes, Other ones bounce all over the place, absolutely, in terms of who's claiming who, for sure. Then we have another way of dividing up this country, American ethnicity by region. What's just the majority? And in terms of that, the second most popular, the third most popular, not I'm saying popular, most populous ethnicity in a region very much affects what it is. When you look at New Orleans, and Italian is a very large population in New Orleans. That affects the personality of the city in a way that you don't see in a lot of other places in the South, for sure. When you're looking at the Southwest and basically a region that spoke Spanish for a very long period of time, yes, it is in America, but has historically been part of this. That's mix and match between the languages really affects how cultures are formed, how things happen. And then a third one I looked at. This one is unlabeled, but it's got the things in the bottom corner. The religion as well. And the religion can definitely put a lot into how people's formative years going to church, how they understand the world forms. You see that big green blob out there, Utah and Mormon. It is quite different than the rest of the West in a lot of ways because they have this influence on them. Absolutely. So, as we're dividing up America, we might come to something like this, a cultural region of the United States. This one, the Northeast, has kind of changed right there. Part of New York is actually in the Midwest. Having grown up in Buffalo, I can agree, Buffalo is halfway between the Midwest and the Northeast. It does not divide Pennsylvania, parts of West Virginia from Massachusetts, Maine, like real New England. The South has Florida going all the way with the South until boom, it stops before Miami in a completely different culture of saying South Florida. Should that be a separate region? In terms of the Pacific, you have all these different ways of looking at things. Is Southern California different than Northern California? How much does that have to do with Portland and Washington? Are they the same in there? Did not look into Hawaiian and Alaska cultures, but as I said earlier, this might end up being a two-timer because now at 17 divisions of what regions I found in terms of fiction, we might do a go west later on for sure. Here we are, putting all three of those together. We have the religion, we have the culture, we have the ethnicity, and you might come across a socioeconomic region of way of putting things together. This breaks off that Southwest from a large portions of the states that they're in. Now we're looking at it in terms of, does states even matter? Should they be broken up in this kind of way instead? The Mid-Atlantic South, it doesn't seem like it's a big deal to say half of Virginia, a little bit of North Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware. Is that its own place? It does have very different jobs, basically. That's what this kind of map is looking at. And then the population centers. Every time I was looking at, okay, who are the authors from Ohio? I'm catching them mostly in those places where those population centers are. So even though we're looking at, Colorado, let's say, you're looking at so many people living in Denver because that's just a huge proportion of the people living anywhere. So it's a very different way of looking at things to say, you have the rural, and then you have bloop, a little dots, and that's where most of the culture really comes from. So that was very interesting. Here we are with those jobs again. And this is the different places that people are staying away from regions. Are you living in a city? Are you living in an exurb? Are you living in a rural area that has a certain type of main job? Are you farming or are you doing something else? And so America is just breaking up in all these very interesting ways. You can always do it in silly ways too, but this kind of stuff affects authors very much. Where is your team? This is an NFL map where different parts of the country root for different football teams. hey, that's going to be who you were watching on Sunday, and it affects the colors that people are wearing, who they're caring about in their daily conversation and small talk and stuff like that. Baseball is a great one, especially when you're going back to authors from the 50s and 60s who they root for affects how they're writing. So these are other funny things, to divide it up. So I do like this map very much. It kind of breaks everything up a little bit further. New England separate from the mid-Atlantic. I do agree with that for sure. But it doesn't really think about those population centers, the cities and stuff like that. So this really was kind of the basis of where I went with a lot of stuff. So here we go. We have 40 minutes or so, give or take. Let's see how far we can get. This is America. There we go. Regional fictionalism. Let's go with New England, New York City, different than the rest of New York very much. The Mid-Atlantic, Appalachia, which crosses parts of a whole bunch of states. The Old South, kind of that Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina. The Deep South, Florida, Louisiana, easy to explain, difficult to understand at times for sure. The old Midwest, where people were coming before the West really was established. Northern pine forests, let's put that as something separate. It is Wisconsin, parts of Michigan, even Minnesota, and it's very different than places like Chicago and Columbus, Ohio, and Indianapolis for sure. Move on down south, and you have Texas, which has very much its own identity. We'll see how that goes. Colorado, New Mexico, I don't feel like they deserve their own, but I do feel like they deserve to be split between that and the rest of the West. Utah, as I said, religious-wise, cultural-wise, very different from the rest of places, and actually have established their own publishing industry based on these factors. The Old West, once again, Southern Cali, different than Northern California, and the Pacific Northwest. I want you guys to think about what authors you read. If you note anything about, where their settings are taking from, toss it in the chat. If you have a favorite region, the place where you read a lot of stuff from. And interesting thing, when I go look up who wrote Jack Reacher and find out that's actually a guy from Surrey, England, and has nothing to do with, let's say, American South, American Midwest whatsoever, but did a very good job of feeling like he really put his reader in these places. So let's see. All right. Starting with New England here, there's a lot of literary fiction, horror, gothic elements, and comedy of manners. I found that a lot in the newer things for sure. Absolutely. Let's see here. The Witch of Blackbird Pond. People might have read that in middle school for sure. Kind of a gothic coming of age novel. Little Women, coming of age as well. Louisa May Alcott. This is an interesting thing about looking at New England and the further northeast stuff is that the length of time, when people are writing and stuff was a lot further for sure. John Irving with Cider House Rules, a more contemporary one, but definitely has that pastoralism that you associate a lot with New England. Ellen Hilderbrand and the Island, and she has a huge amount of books, absolutely, but very much focused on Nantucket, kind of those little separate areas, where the moneyed classes are in New England and the old money and stuff like that. And so that clash between let's say an everyday American and the old money of New England creates these comedy of manners very much for sure. Stephen King, well known from Maine, and those very quiet vistas in the dark forests and on craggy, rock-filled beaches, inform a lot of his stuff. You have very old houses, and that can create, kind of the Victorian looks to things and stuff like that. That can be amazing settings for horror stuff. Absolutely. John Updike, taking a very different way of looking at things. I does his literary fiction, his soul searching through his character Rabbit. I and although it's not looked upon very well by contemporary audiences, I was absolutely had the New York literary scene in a chokehold for 30 years of the 70s and 80s and all. Yeah, Brian McMahon and C.V. Road with kind of a family drama about the opioid crisis and how that was kind of tearing apart things. I with that and Jodi Picoult with My Sister's Keeper, very New England for sure. So you have a lot of the universities there, especially Ivy League places and things like that. And so that's where a lot of these literary fiction writers are being, literary fiction authors are studying. And so if they're studying there, they're using elements of the environment around them and creating these. And I think that's definitely a part of why these very much come up in literary fiction. There's lots of New England settings for sure. Had mentioned already the horror things and how those old houses and those very old kind of like weathered falling apart places I create awesome scenes for horror stuff. Absolutely. Shannon, I think I heard Shannon. Awesome. Then turning around on my a lot of the gothic stuff, Witch of Blashbird Pond and stuff like that, but heavy drama and that goes with the horror. My as well as the lighter stuff, on the coast and dealing with the clash of upper and lower classes very much plays into a lot of New England fiction for sure. What you doing, buddy? Hi, Shannon. I think you might be talking to a Margot. All right. New York City, which very much to me includes all the boroughs as well as Long Island, a bit of Newark for sure, a bit of upstates, a little bit higher than that, and the other part of it as well, in Connecticut too, for sure. Now, there's a lot of gritty drama that comes out of New York City, and a lot of authors who, grew up in lower class situations and then came to be authors later. In the corner up there, Elizabeth Acevedo, the poet X, as well as things like Reed Jane, Patricia Park, which is about a young Asian Korean woman who is working as a nanny for a rich family and then travels back to Korea. And so you get that setting as well. But the clash between what her expectation is over in Korea and then her societal expectation here in the United States is very different for sure. James Baldwin, very much of New York City in that combative way of kind of speaking, coming out of very much, the Harlem Renaissance and standing up for Black culture for 100 years for sure. Next to that, Joan Didion and the memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking. Really this kind of introspective stuff, but also, my class conflict in there as well. Colston Whitehead. In this case, The Underground Railroad is a science fiction kind of alt history book, but very different for sure in terms of his approach to the world, I would say, because he's coming from New York City and therefore is kind of in this rigid way of looking at things. Going back in history in Edith Wharton and the House of Mirth, very different from Little Women. If you're looking at what authors are writing in New England and coming from small towns and small families, you have a kind of a period piece. It was written at the time. But more similar to Jane Eyre and English kind of novels of the time for sure. J.D. Salinger and A Catcher in the Rye. Catcher in the Rye very much is this kid going to New York City, experiencing it for the first time, and that shock of things is a huge part of it for sure. My beloved and Toni Morrison. Toni Morrison was born somewhere else, but came to New York City worked as an editor for a publisher for about 25 years before publishing a novel. And very much I feel in her prose and how sculpted it is, I'm going to put her in this New York City category, even though several different places in the United States claim her. But I do believe very much that this is, of that ethos of kind of a gritty drama and very much a New York City author, even if it is set somewhere completely different. Get to the mid-Atlantic, and I'm going to call this, kind of upstate New York, most of Pennsylvania, parts of Maryland. And that has just one thing as well. I has a lot of those Ivy League schools and has a lot of universities, so you have a lot of trained authors coming up there, but also has a very distinct style to it. It feels they're still doing the literary fiction, but it's a lot more Bildungsroman, which is a term for authors, writing about someone coming of age. Lots of angst and tragedy from the OG, Baltimore's own Edgar Allan Poe, and his very much very angsty, very tragic stuff to My Side of the Mountain, Gene Craighead George. I loved this book as a kid. This is once again growing up in upstate New York, in the country for sure. It was like, oh yeah, I could survive out in the wilderness by myself for a while, trapping, animals and stuff like that, hunting and gathering food out there. But that's very much a Bildungsroman, coming up, learning to deal with yourself and running away from home. When you go to George Saunders, very upstate, he do believe he teaches at Syracuse. But Lincoln in the Bardo and several of his other books. Wonder if I still have it. Oh, not at hand. I I think it's the fall and decline of Civil War land. It's just kind of much more rural. You're looking at New York, but you're not in New York City in any way. And how this is closer to the Midwest in a lot of ways. Judy Blume and Are You There? Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret. I once again coming of age for sure. Pretty Little Liars by Sarah Shepard as well. Much more known as a TV show, but it has a very specific setting, I believe, in Elizabeth, Pennsylvania. I will have to look that up again for sure, but it feels very interesting to me that is that is the setting for Pretty Little Liars, which otherwise, when you put it in a Hollywood setting, could be anywhere for sure. Rhonda is saying Adirondack. Yes, Syracuse is in the kind of Adirondacks. But that is, kind of a chain just above the Appalachians and could be considered another part of it for sure. Philip Roth out of Newark, New Jersey, an American pastoral. And Philip Roth is another one that, like John Updike, was so popular in the 60s and 70s and very much was of his time in terms of how he's writing it, but it's so terribly introspective in so much stuff. But it feels like a very different tone than Updike for sure. And Philip Roth writing these things that are very angsty and has some tragedy to it, where Updike would have a less dramatic plot, let's say. Go on again to Alice Sebold and the Lovely Bones, another Pennsylvania author as well. So this is kind of it feels very different than the New York City kind of stuff, and related, but I mean, I could say this as well, a very different religious background than New England, where you're going to have a lot more of that Puritanism in there and also that fear that comes with Puritanism of hell and stuff like that. And I believe gives a lot more of the horror and gothic elements to it. Whereas in the Mid-Atlantic, you did have a lot more, let's say, chill religions, or at least religious upbringings. And I do believe that comes with a lot of these, situations for sure. Now, of course, Rhonda's going to have some opinions on this. And when you talk about Appalachia, you're talking about there's a tiny bit in New York, but mostly just central Pennsylvania. West Virginia, bits of what can I say? Virginia, the Carolinas, tiny bit of Georgia, perhaps, and the top end of Mississippi, as well as about half of Kentucky and Tennessee. Now, Ohio has a little claim, maybe a little bit more than New York does, but really, it's a very different situation in terms of that, a very different religious situation, a very different ethnic situation. Scotch Irish and African American, very much, and going back hundreds and hundreds of years. Bell Hooks is from Appalachia, is from Kentucky. And I so much would have put her at either New York City or Northern California in terms of how her opinions were formed and stuff like that. But she did write this Appalachian Elegy. And I actually, someone has coined the term Affrilacia. I'm pronouncing it wrong, Appalachia, about the African American kind of history in Appalachia, but they do seem very well intertwined as well, the black and white histories there. So Bell Hooks is a start right there. Carter Sickles, The Prettiest Star, with a newer book. And this is that little bit of Appalachia that touches Ohio. Not going to call it the Midwest whatsoever, but kind of the hilly regions, with falling down small towns that used to be big when coal mining was a thing, and dealing with the AIDS epidemic, dealing with coming from somewhere like New York City and having to move back home and being in a completely different situation and cut off from a lot of that self-expression that can happen in a city that becomes very cut and dry, very marginalized when you're in a small town. Leah Hampton, Fuckface and Other Stories, is very hilarious and kind of on the edge of those folk tales in there as well. Cormac McCarthy, for all I want to call him a Western author, he absolutely wrote almost all of his stuff in Knoxville, Tennessee, in a here we go. In a small shack, like without a phone line. Pretty sure he had electricity, but this is really where he was coming from for sure. And a lot of that grittiness, as well as I think if not fantasy, hallucination and folk aspect of his stuff, I think very much influenced him, even if, things like On the Road or about near El Paso, No Country for Old Men, great book about Texas for sure. But I'm going to give him to Appalachia for sure in terms of a very strong and very gritty author who just kind of like did things on their own terms. Cold Mountain, by Charles Fraser, extremely popular, and that is about a Southern soldier. I do believe it's post-war, trying to get back to his wife up in the mountains, and the real environment that he's coming across in that time. Linda Codega and Moth Eater, mixing that realistic and folk. Like, is this going to be is this going to be a fantasy, or is this, it's not quite magical realism. It doesn't fit into that category, but, like, is the old lady in town a witch? Does she know spells? Kind of things where it's very mixed in. Is it realistic fiction or not? And Appalachia is great at kind of blending those two things for sure. Rocket Boys by Homer Hickam is a memoir as well, but about kids messing around with rockets back in the day and very much about growing up in that environment. Fanny Flag, Fried Green Tomatoes at the Whistle Stop Cafe turned into a movie that's much more popular. And one of those ones as well, where do I count Fanny Flag as Deep South? Or is Fanny Flag more Appalachian? Now, growing up in Birmingham, Alabama is on the very, very bottom end of Appalachia. And in terms of the small town aspect and stuff like that, I put her here in Appalachia, gave it to her. The Bog Wife, I do believe, is one that Anna read, and I don't think she's here today, but I really enjoy that one for sure. And oh, here we go. I shrink that. You from below, I wandering through a post, if not post-industrial, I post mining town. And once again, but in a more literary fashion, similar to Moth Eater, mixing the is this fantastic or is this realistic kind of way of doing things. And I think a lot of the folk tales and folk ways of Appalachia bleed into the way that authors write there for sure. Class dramas as well. You do have a lot of high poverty in Appalachia, and that is explored very much as well in terms of these novels for sure. Move on. We have the Old South. Now, the Old South, I would say, let's give a little bit of Maryland, so like Chevy Chase and Washington, D.C., as well as Virginia and the Carolinas going down to South Carolina, maybe Georgia as well. But there's a different way that it was built in terms of the original colonists, and it ended up having the tobacco plantations and stuff like that back in the day. That was very different than the later migration to the deep south and cotton industrialization, and really the changing of the slave system in the United States from a solid, we're not really importing, we're not really trying to grow, let's just, keep the status quo way of systems that is based on English tenement farmers of the serfdom era to very much in the deep south, we are going full hog capitalist on this and how different that happens. So the old South, I'm going to say, is different than the deep South so much in that case for sure. Let's see here. So right near Washington, D.C., that northern Virginia area is so much, cosmopolitan, is of the world. David Baldacci in a lot of his thriller and kind of psychological novels feel of that and don't feel very Southern for sure, except that it is kind of a family drama for sure. It does have some gothic elements where you do want to have a real slowly moving story and revealing itself over time, but it's in a contemporary setting. And the shadows, if they're not direct, in a room, the shadows are in people's motivations. And that is very Southern and very different than the kind of harshness you'll get in looking at much more Northern novels. Me Talk Pretty One Day and David Sedaris, great humorist, absolutely. And the fact is that what he does is humor and is mostly short fiction, but does definitely fit into the family saga thing where he is recounting both his own life, but also about his family. All of these humorous things that have happened to them over time. They could be tragic, very much so, and he spins it in a certain way. But that was interesting. North Carolina in his case. Maya Angelou, I gave Maya Angelou to the Old South as well, and I Know Why the Caged Birds Sing. That's another memoir for sure about this conflict and this difficulty splitting between my self-identity and relating to the wider world for sure. Now, The Tobacco Wives, a much more contemporary novel for sure. Is by Adele Myers and is going back to a small town and seeing all of that drama come together, where people relate to each other and how a lot of that old system is being challenged today. So the drama of mixing with that, and coming from, let's say, like a blank Americana idea to an old South kind of way of doing things as well. I John Jakes and a very popular series, the North and South, I trilogy. That's a saga. That is absolutely my going through all the family histories and just decades and decades, my generations and generations before and after the Civil War. It feels very much of that kind of like honor-based society that the old South has, that is pretty different than the caste system of Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Georgia for sure. Come across Porgy as well, which was a novel and was from South Carolina, the basis for Porgy and Bess, the very popular Gershwin? No, Rodgers and Hammerstein, musical as well. Pat Conroy and the Prince of Tides, writes contemporary fiction. I very much is using that scenery of it. I You could call it family saga for sure, but very much kind of like slowing things down. And using that as dramatic effect for sure. And The Secret Life of Bees, if anybody has read that. I by There we go, Sue Monk Kidd. It's much more contemporary novel, and it's interesting to look at how, if you have the earliest writers from a certain place, let's say it's, New England, and it's Nathaniel Hawthorne. If it is the New York area and it is Washington Irving, um, how did those affect people who came after them? And then you start to look at places like, the Old South, and as we get further west, it's different. And what were their influences? So some of the earlier authors that I looked in to the Old South, and what stuff was written by authors, before, I was, let's say, not acceptable today. It was a lot of people writing things that were, very much reinforcing their way of life. Politicians, stuff like that. They didn't really create so much art and fiction as much as nonfiction, and very much philosophically justifying their way of life. It's terribly interesting to me. In terms of that, these authors grew up with that and very much, in a lot of ways, revolted against that. But not nearly as much as other places for sure. I think New York City and a lot of what its history in terms of literary fiction is bouncing off of, is definitely challenging what came before it, whether it is J.D. Salinger or Toni Morrison or Colston Whitehead. They're challenging what came before them and trying to take the tropes that existed and flip them on their head, versus somewhere with a lot more continuity to what they're trying to write. And in the South, kind of pushing this forward, I to say the South is still hung up on what it once was. Difference here. We have the Old South, and that was a lot of newer writers. We had the Deep South, and I was very surprised the difference between who got famous from Virginia, the Carolinas, and Mississippi, Alabama. Mississippi, Alabama has an extremely deep bench in terms of authors. I was a bit surprised at this. I knew some of these already, but to look again and again at not only how they use the environment that they grew up in, but also how they have antecedents that definitely feed into their work, was terribly interesting to me. Now, you do have two very strong ones to begin with. Flannery O'Connor, And her stories are amazing for sure. She's from Georgia, and so I'm going to put her in because of the type of writing that she did, whereas other ones I saw from Georgia would be more the old South style. She's very much of the deep South, it feels, in that literary fiction, the soul searching, and the focus on tragedy. William Faulkner, The Town, I very much, like created his own way. He had an entire I thing around him of who was the most important writers at the time for sure. And you go to Eudora Welty and The Optimist's Daughter. So this is, the early 20th century and how important Mississippi and Alabama were in my American fiction. And this is before civil rights, before any of the changes that happened to the South. Yet it was really important without going to, let's say, I reinforce the old way of being. These were very much soul searching things that were looking for who are we in society. Eudora Welty wrote some very scathing messages when the civil rights movement was starting to happen and people were being attacked and murdered in the streets. And she was like, that shit ain't right, even though she was very old school white Mississippi for sure. We have John Grisham, and very much like David Baldacci is a person of refined taste for sure, and using a bit of those gothic elements for things like the Pelican Brief and the Firm, where he was very used to what he was doing for work. In one of those maps earlier, it was very interesting to see what do people do in different parts of the country in terms of work, and how does that inform what authors write about in those places. We have Catherine Stockett and The Help in terms of what people are doing, what they're writing about. If anybody knows the twist, keep it for now. But the old school system of essentially serfdom that was in the American South, it definitely has many ways of getting back at someone who treats you poorly. The Secret History by Donna Tartt, and Donna Tartt wrote a lot of great novels. Absolutely, but very much that introspection, and I would say coming from the Flannery O'Connor, William Faulkner way of writing, but making it much more poppy as well. Move on to Angie Thomas and the extremely popular The Hate You Give, which came out in the past decade, as well as Richard Wright and Richard Wright's Native Son. I do believe most of the time he was writing was in the 60s and 70s, could have been earlier in the 50s as well, but really was an extremely powerful voice in terms of this at a time when New York City writers, we were talking about Baldwin earlier and stuff, Chicago writers and stuff were really getting somewhere. He paved a path in Mississippi that did very well for him and for explaining kind of the socioeconomic situation that he was living through. All right. I'm going to check on the chat again. I know you guys are talking about stuff. Absolutely. No problem. Y'all have fun in the chat. All right. What is the South but is not the South? Florida. Florida is not the South. I did find some elements that were interestingly of, all my Southern stuff for sure, but it has a very different personality to it. I'm going to say outlandish, ennui, and Gothic and Espanol. So when you have things like Carl Hyacin and Dave Barry, Tourist Season in Insane City, these two examples I have right here, but like this humorous aspect to it. It has a lot more to do with New York City and kind of like satirizing things and doing it in a very gutting way. And a playfulness to it that seems very out of step with a lot of Southern writing. Move on to Elmore Leonard. I saw this as well. I guess he was born in Minnesota, but I'm not giving Elmore Leonard to the piney woods up there. No, he is such a Florida guy. Out of Sight, a movie that I saw maybe when I was 16 or something like that, and extremely enjoyed. But it was very much of this kind of California way of looking at things, of you are having shootouts, absurd situations, mix-ups that lead to fortune and fame. And so very much Elmore Leonard feels of Florida and uses his environment extremely well in terms of setting up his plots and stuff like that. But so many Florida things on that first row right there, they feel like a kind of a cut and dry, you know. There is not a lot of soul searching to that, you know, related to the Deep South. You go to Zora Neale Hurston, and their eyes are watching God. That is more of the South for sure in terms of what her novel is, but as well, it does feel out of step with things like Native Son and David Wright. It does feel different. It does feel lighter. It does feel less caught in history, let's say. Lauren Groff, great Florida writer, very much writes of Florida, has a book called Florida. No, I did not put it on here. I but is a more contemporary writer and very much has that Americana view of just like growing up in the suburbs. And the suburbs is very much a blanket way of looking at the US. It's a type of living that doesn't exist nearly as much in other countries, but is very important. And so I think that lost in the suburbs aspect of her stuff is definitely bracketed by things that are very Florida for sure. Absolutely. I here we go. I when we move on to Miami, I found a very interesting thread through Cuban American writings, and that was a very Gothic way of looking at things by authors writing in Spanish. So La Isla de los Amores Infinitos. It was a very interesting book by Diana Chivario, and Dreaming in Cuban by Cristina Garcia. We're like using Caribbean Gothic, basically, whether writing in English or Spanish, but this Cuban diaspora, and very much, you know, you saw on that early map of where the cultures, you know, in America. And if you're cutting off that toe of Florida and saying it's not the South, these are some very big reasons why it is still the South. It is a little bit of horror, a little bit of darkness, dark, you know, big shadows, wondering things, slow plots, but it's the influence of that and the Caribbean, my coming together. And so I found that to be terribly fun. Absolutely. Moving on from there, another state that is in the South, but is not of the South for sure. Louisiana, New Orleans specifically. Gothic thrillers, they're fantastic, they're spooky. Can't go without the OG first, Anne Rice, and Interview with the Vampire. Even though her settings can be other places and stuff like that, it feels like this is a New Orleans writer for sure. It is vampires, it is fantasy, but it is very much of the place that she was existing. James Lee Burke and all of his mystery novels, really gritty, really taking that kind of like California noir, but making it his own, very much of the space, very much of Louisiana, of New Orleans. And an old school one, Dinner at Antoine's, which was a hit in 1948 by Francis Parkinson Keys, is kind of like a comedy of manners kind of thing. I relates to that kind of New England way of looking at things, where it's like the old money and the new money, of which New Orleans very much has that, and has had very powerful families for generations and generations. In a different way than a lot of the rest of the South has for sure. John Kennedy O'Toole and a Confederacy of Dunces is like a day in the life of, you know, it's a James Joyce Ulysses type of novel, except about the American South, about New Orleans for sure. Ernest Gaines and A Lesson Before Dying. It brings that deep South difficulty, that wrestling with yourself, that soul searching, but it puts it in a Louisiana cast for sure, absolutely. And we get to things like Shadows in Summerland, a historical novel with fantasy elements. And the very popular Jasmine Ward out of Baton Rouge, I believe, with Salvage the Bones, which is once again like the Deep South, kind of like wrestling with things, but it feels different. It feels more gothic. It feels slower I then kind of the then the Mississippi Alabama version of what a novel like this would have been. I love this Shannon saying, "Oh my God, we had so many Dave Barry books when I was a kid. My dad made us read his book on New Parenthood when I was 6 and my mom was pregnant." You were
Yeah.
It's just silly. It's just silly shit, isn't it?
Oh yeah, no, I mean the whole book is silly. So I think he was trying to get us to be less freaked out about having a new baby in the house, but the whole thing is like don't carry the baby by the head, that kind of stuff. It's just I kind of understand if you need that sort of reference why Florida Man exists.
Yeah, no, there are some examples, and I wish I would have, I had more time to dive into it. But like even stranger examples of Florida novels, that are so of Florida. It is the South in some ways for sure, but it doesn't. In terms of literary stuff, mesh with the rest of the territory at all.
One of the
Absolutely.
things that I do want to mention about Florida, and I didn't want to like steal your stuff, and one of so sorry, going backwards. Florida has a ton of location-based mysteries,
Mhm.
and maybe because people who are older have more time to write, and they also retire to Florida. But using the Everglades and mysteries, or using the heat as the backdrop to an investigation is incredibly common. And I think the one thing that we can all agree on is that Florida is a miserable place to live and die. And that may that may be part of why there's so much outlandishness in their stories.
Well, romance and mystery very much. I have authors who write about different places and will, just like either with a single character and having them go from one place to another, or like different characters, different, like standalones and stuff like that. Just do it based on, like one small town in a particular place. So it was very interesting doing this and looking at the difference between a novel set in a location and an author writing about it who has some precedent, of how they're attached to it for sure. But you're right, there are so many novels out there, and I had to weed out who actually lived in Florida, as I was looking through them. Yeah. All right. Okay, let's do one more. We're right about it too, and we've just gotten up to the Mississippi River, right through Louisiana. Let's move up north past Appalachia and go to the old Midwest. The old Midwest, I'm going to call that most of Ohio, Indiana, most of Michigan, Illinois. I'm gonna say that's about it. Like that southern part of Wisconsin is really just a suburb of Chicago. Of course, throw that in, absolutely. But very interesting to be looking at the different novels coming out of there and see, okay, just kind of like the those mid-Atlantic states that are just to the east of them, there's a lot of Bildungsroman. There's a lot of growing up, in the novels that come from this place. The family dramas, there were lots of them. And like the South, like looking at a town or a family and like following them for a while kind of thing. And a lot of introspection. Like there was a lot of Americana, things that we associate with Americana, or you could say New York City type stuff, things like that. They were very interestingly out of there. So I'm going to start with Hanif Abukurab's. They can't kill us until they kill us. Mr. writes poems, essays, nonfiction, fiction, and is very much out of Columbus, Ohio, and makes that a big part of his identity. And I really love the contemporary stuff that he's doing, and how in looking at contemporary American things, how can you have a perspective? If you're coming from the crossroads of America and Columbus, that is terribly interesting to me. Another Ohioan as well, R.L. Stein. And he did move and starts, writing somewhere else. But I do feel like his settings are very much this Midwest thing. And when I found that he actually wrote his autobiography and called it "It Came from Ohio" with him with a whole bunch of monsters, had to include him for sure. Similarly, without the horror, Winesburg, Ohio, is a formative piece of literature about kind of the area, the Midwest, and how people were looking at things, and it's a very pastoral sense of things. By Sherwood Anderson was a formative part. He was a formative part of the Chicago scene that developed in the late 1800s, early 2000s. Yes, early 1900s. And how that kind of became, Chicago became a locus for a lot of stuff. Once again, universities played a part in this, and Chicago, as the universities grew up, definitely grew an author class for sure. But the stark difference between centers of a population and living in the middle of frickin' nowhere. Was similar here to Appalachia, where you have a lot of authors who are not living in the cities and are still producing very interesting stuff. Jumping back in history as well, even further, Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin. I gave this to Ohio, giving this to the Midwest, because although she was from further east, it was moving to Cincinnati, seeing the class conflict between Irish immigrants, runaway slaves, or free black folks living in Ohio, and the commerce on the Ohio River as the U.S. was expanding, that really gave her the genesis of Uncle Tom's Cabin. And so I'm going to say this is very much an Ohio novel for sure, and give it to them. Similar as well, Joyce Carol Oates going to give her to Detroit. Do with me what you will, but also she wrote many other novels for sure. And it is a bit of that New York City issue, where authors have one or maybe two successes, and so many of them move to Los Angeles or New York City. And from then on, it's like, okay, well, am I going to say that you're from the place where you are, where you were, or from your new place, where you're living in the world? But Joyce Carol Oates, I really do feel, is of that kind of Detroit, suburban, Michigan, Midwestern way of looking at things. She's very cut and dry in terms of things. I and wanted to look at family dramas and did not have the harshness, the conflict, the trying to tear down the previous that a lot of New York authors would have had. Similarly, Kurt Vonnegut, Slaughterhouse-Five from Indiana. There's some absurdity to his stuff for sure. Kind of can put him as as a world traveler for sure, but similar to George Saunders, I really do feel like there's a lot to do with where he grew up that influenced his writing, even post him getting famous. He also was a teacher at a university in Chicago for quite a while as well. I'm going to finish it off here with Sandra Cisneros and The House on Mango Street, which is a Chicago novel. It's not about anywhere in the South, in the Southeast, in California whatsoever. That's a Chicago novel. So very interesting to me to see that on here. And then it was from there. And I said, geez, Bildungsroman right there. I totally can see where this is, a family drama. Bildungsroman, very introspective. It is all of those at once. So the old Midwest, is there a new Midwest? Is it part of the West? We'll find out next time, because we are talking until 2 o'clock and it is 2:02. I'm glad I got a decent amount of the way through this. We got up to my Chicago and Louisiana. I can kind of cut the nation in half for sure. I I got this here, I from Shannon as well. In these rural areas in the Midwest, I think the flatness of the land plays into the ethos. Even if the land isn't part of the story, you have to face the family conflict. Even if you try to leave, you can't, and it feels like that. It's either them or the corn. Even if you travel 5 miles, the ground is flattish, and you're still visible, but ever present and never hidden. I love that. Absolutely. So that's about half the US, and we'll see, guys. Maybe next month I'll come back and do the regionalism of America. What am I thinking? Go West. We'll call it Go West. If anybody has questions about the ones that we talked about today, or your own observations, authors that you love from particular areas and how they build their thing, toss them in the chat. Feel free to unmute. We've got a few minutes to talk if you would like. Absolutely.
While people are looking at that, I just want to remind you that we do this every single week. Next week just happens to be me, and I will be talking about writing speculative satire. But you can find all of our events that we have planned on Eventbrite underneath Houston Independent Authors. And if you follow us, you will be notified by Eventbrite when we add new things.
Yes, Kurt Vonnegut right at the very end, and then that's what you're talking about next. So that's the lead in right there. Speculative satire. Interesting ones as well. I found things like Tom Robbins. His novels feel very of the Pacific Northwest, and then Virginia trying to claim him and saying, "Oh no, he's from Virginia." And I was like, that doesn't sound right. All right. Well, if nobody has any questions, thank you guys so much for coming to Writer's Lunch today. See you next week for Speculative Satire with Shannon. Y'all have a great day. Wait, I'm gonna look in the chat. Let me make sure I'm not missing anything. Yay, okay, good. Just nice things in there. Bye.